30 years of uninterrupted economic growth have made many believe Australia's economy is infallible. With ever-increasing interest rates, high inflation, and income growth lagging, the rising cost of living has run the ship aground. Is this the end of Australia's once booming economy? Why is no one talking about it? What becomes of the average Australian man?
When Australia is in recession for the first time in nearly 30 years as the coronavirus pandemic sent the economy into a tailspin.
After recovering from the 1992 recession, Australia had a record-setting 28 years of continuous economic growth until the COVID-19 pandemic struck in 2020. Not even the mid-1990s Asian financial crisis or the global financial crisis of 2008 could stop Australia's thriving economy. During these periods, the government supported households with direct payments. China's demand for iron ore helped Australia avoid trade deficits throughout the 1990s. The global financial crisis plunged many developed economies into the deep, including the US and Europe, but Australia was able to scale through. But since then, Australia's economy has been struggling. At first, experts attributed it to the pandemic. The COVID-19 pandemic brought one of the most severe global recessions. Lockdowns and travel restrictions stopped growth. Jobs were lost, and Australia didn't escape. The economy began recovering in the third quarter of 2020, and GDP increased by 3.3%. A lesser-felt economic dip occurred during the Delta variant outbreak in mid-2021. Since then, Australian economic recovery has struggled amid rising interest rates, weak productivity, and low demand for Australian exports. Aside from the pandemic, the Australian economy has been at its weakest since the 1990s. Companies are massively laying off highly skilled professionals across sectors. The tricky part is that the signs of economic decline in Australia aren't the typical ones. Recession is an indicator of economic health. When economic growth reverses, business profits reduce, followed by job losses. But this is not exactly the case with Australia's economy right now. Though GDP growth and unemployment numbers do not indicate a significant reduction in economic activity, the living standards of many Aussies are declining. Every Australian is $2,400 worse off each year than expected. What's going on? Australia's economy showed modest growth, with the gross domestic product, GDP, increasing by only 0.8% in the first 3 quarters of 2024. However, the economic growth can stem from 2 sources: more consumers buying goods, extensive growth, or increased production efficiency, intensive growth. According to figures from the Australian Bureau of Statistics released in September 2024, the net overseas migration reached 509,800 from March 2023 to March 2024, slightly down from the 518,000 the previous year. This influx of people helped keep the country out of a technical recession, but productivity levels at that time were concerning. Based on this continuous trend, the government's intergenerational report forecasted that, like many other developed countries, Australia is likely to experience slower economic growth over the next 40 years. It predicts an average real GDP growth of just 2.2% annually, which is 0.9 percentage points lower than the average rate seen over the last 4 decades. The national economy is growing, but not fast enough to support the increasing population. So the GDP is rising, but the GDP per person is falling. Bloomberg reported that aside from the COVID years, the March 2024 quarter was the lowest GDP per person since 1991. That means individual living standards are getting worse. In 2024, the average disposable income per household fell by 6%, and household debt reached 112% of the GDP. Many Australians often have to work more hours just to afford healthy food and healthcare. Australians are getting poorer by the year. Why? At the start of the pandemic, the Morrison government spent $429 billion in financial support. Experts later said it was more than they had lost. After that, inflation increased to 7.8% in late 2022, but wages remained unchanged. Meanwhile, Australia's population surpassed 27 million in March 2024. Migration can help fill job gaps and boost the economy, but it also increases demand for housing and services. House prices and rents have hit all-time highs. Rising living costs and poor financial conditions are impacting household spending. The unemployment rate has increased from a record low of 3.5% in late 2022 to over 4% in 2024. Wages have increased by 1.5% since 2019, but what your income is worth after inflation is still 4.8% lower than before the pandemic. This means that most of the income is spent on basic needs, like housing, groceries, bills, fuel, and healthcare, leaving less money for savings. Research firm Roy Morgan shows that 28.9% of Australians were at risk of mortgage stress. Since the RBA started increasing interest rates in May 2022, the number of people struggling with mortgage repayment has increased by 826,000. Inflation is a global problem. Australia has been facing supply chain problems for 2 years before energy and food prices increased. As a result, Australia's inflation took off and sat at 6.1% in June 2024. To deal with this, the central bank raised rates from 0.1 to 1.85% in just 4 months. High interest rates reduce consumer confidence, spending, and demand. Domestic demand looked to be cooling earlier in 2024, but retail sales saw an annual rise of 3.8% between January 2024 and January 2025. The International Monetary Fund, IMF, expects global growth to be below the average of 3.3% in 2025, showing that countries may struggle to balance inflation with economic activity. Many central banks began to increase interest rates to control inflation in mid-2024. In February 2025, the Reserve Bank of Australia, RBA, reduced the cash rate to 4.1%, having peaked at 4.35% for more than 12 months. Anyways, that is not so high compared to many major economies. Questions arose about whether central banks had left rates too high for too long. The world has seen major disruptions in supply chains due to COVID-19, trade tariffs, product shortages, and China's strict zero-COVID policies. For Australia, an island nation that relies heavily on imports, these logistical challenges hit harder than many other countries. Business surveys show that supply chain disruptions rank alongside labor as a major constraint on business activity. Across the economy, 41% of businesses are currently affected. They either cannot get the goods they need at all, or those goods are too expensive. For retail and manufacturing, 2/3 are materially affected. The supply chain problem persists. According to AI Group data, the PMI Input Prices Indicator, the best national measure for supply chain stress, has reached an all-time high of 89. For context, 50 indicates neutral and has never exceeded the low 70s in its 3-decade history. Australia's economy has relied heavily on immigration since the White Settlement. Over the last 2 decades, Australia has averaged a net intake of 191,000 new migrants annually to strengthen its skilled workforce. International border restrictions between March 2020 and February 2022 temporarily paused migration. Migration turned net negative in 2021 for the first time since 1947. Labor shortages after the pandemic made Australia open its borders to international students and skilled migrants in 2022, resulting in a record-breaking net of 547,200 migrants in 2023. Despite this, unemployment currently sits at 3.5% and underemployment at 6.1%.
Could be heading for a recession with predictions that 100,000 Aussies will lose their jobs in the next year. Unemployment is currently at 4.2%, but a new report from Deloitte forecasts the jobless rate will peak at 4.5%.
Businesses are facing chronic staff shortages. 1/3 of small businesses and 2/3 of medium and large businesses report being unable to secure enough staff. The reasons are clear. 79% of businesses stated they received no applications, while 59% point to a mismatch between the skills needed and those available. What could be responsible for this? Of course, Trump's Liberation Day tariffs will disrupt the global markets, but experts believe Australia will be less affected than many other countries. This is because Australia received the lowest tariff rate, just 10%. Also, the US isn't a huge export market for Australia. Between 2023 and 2024, Australia exported roughly $22 billion worth of goods to the US, less than 5% of its total exports. Besides, Australia can sell those goods to other countries if they choose to. In other words, Trump's tariffs could affect just 0.2% of Australia's GDP. So, it will not be a major factor in the country's economic collapse. Still, there are indirect risks. 85% of Australia's exports, which make up 18% of its GDP, go to Asia. 36.8% and 14.5% of Australia's exports go to China and Japan, respectively, from 2023 to 2024. Now, Trump has imposed a 125% tariff on China and announced a 24% tariff on Japan. If these tariffs remain, all countries might change how they trade with the US and one another. Something similar happened in 2020 when China banned several Australian goods over a political dispute. Though hurt, the Australian marketers found new markets, and many of those relationships still stand, even though China has lifted the bans. If China's economy slows down, Australia could feel it, especially if iron ore prices drop, which would reduce GDP. However, China is now focusing more on trade with developing countries to boost its economy after losing access to the US market. The Australian Unity Wellbeing Index, AUWI, report by Deakin University, which has run for 24 years, reports that life satisfaction in Australia hit a record low in 2024. People from low-income households are more likely to have mental health challenges and lower well-being. That should be a major cause for concern. If everyone is going through a mental health challenge because of a country, then is it really worth it? Will Australia emerge from all the challenges that currently plague its economy? Let's hear your thoughts in the comments.